As we are approaching ever closer the release of Season 4, one of the questions players might be asking is, of course, which spec, which character do they feel like they're going to be playing in the season. Of course, the other question could be, do I even bother playing this season? It looks kind of boring right now. But, you know, let's stay in the positive side of the questioning, wondering about what to play. So for today, we come to the help of players to try to give them a little bit more of a nudge towards the spec they might be preferring by looking at how fast or how slow the specs are. How many buttons are they pressing? How often? How hectic and fast is the rotation, or the opposite? How chill? How laid back? How relaxed is the rotation of each spec? Because of course this can be quite the divider, right? One of the things that players might be looking for when choosing a spec, you know, just how much do I have to sweat to play the spec? How soon will I be diagnosed with a carpal tunnel syndrome by playing this spec? So let's start, of course, with the first disclaimer, which is that in general, you can expect tanks to be amongst the fastest button pressers. You know, this is very simple. Tanks do have their standard mitigation defensive off the global cooldown, which means they can basically use it as an extra button as they are pressing something else. Like, for example, Iron Fur of a Guardian Druid or Shield of the Righteous of a Prot Paladin. So that's why when it comes to tanks, even the slowest of the tanks, which is Guardian, has 65 actions per minute, button presses per minute, so over 1 per second. After that, you have Vengeance Demon Hunter with 68, Blood Decay with 70, together with Brewmaster, and then with a significant gap far ahead at 86 and 88, you have Protection Warrior and Protection Paladin, sitting at almost 1.5 button presses per minute. In those two cases, it has perhaps to do more with the fact that their off-the-global cooldown tools are also used for damage, and even more so later in the season, they are overflowing with stats, allowing them to just spam things like Shield Slam and Ignore Pain for Protection Warrior and Shield of the Righteous for Protection Paladin, which are much more plentiful in the spammability as opposed to something like Iron Fur of a Guardian Druid. But in general, as we have seen, tanks are quite fast, much more so than your average DPS, because if we go in the bottom 5 of the slowest of the DPS, you have Devastation Evoker as the absolute bottom with only 32 button presses per minute, barely one every couple seconds. Well, the answer is obvious. You have the vast majority of your damage and also of your casts being made up of Disintegrate, which is a channel. So you ain't pressing anything while you're channeling Disintegrate. That's what makes Devastation so slow, especially on single target. That's where you start to realize, then probably most of the casters will be pretty low on the APM meter, right? Because they have to cast, so they have to be slower than your average button presser. Well, what might surprise you is that you actually have Marksmanship Hunter at 46, and then the other two Warlock specs, Destro and Demo. Now, for the Warlock specs, it makes plenty sense, right? Because you have Affliction, which has to channel Drain Soul, they have to hardcast things like Seed of Corruption in AoE or Malefic Rapture, the much loved spender of Affliction Warlocks, and even Unstable Affliction. Those are all lengthy casts. Same goes for Destruction, which has its typical combo of Incinerate of Chaos Bolt, which puts them pretty low in the APM, and also with Demo, even more so nowadays, where they cast Demon Bolt even more, which is a casted ability together with Hand of Gul'dan. It does make them pretty slow overall. And well, of course, Augmentation Evoker, but that doesn't really come as a surprise, barely scraping near 40 APM, most of its cast being Eruption, a cast ability, even Living Flame, another cast ability, as well as Fire Breath, Upheaval, etc. It's mostly a slow casting spec. But this, you know, we kind of knew already. The surprise is that in the middle of these pure casters, you have Marksmanship Hunter. Because Marksmanship Hunter, when you think about it, you know, it's a hunter, it's fast, it's quick. Well, you know, Marksmanship uses Aim Shot, Rapid Fire, and Steady Shot, which are all casted abilities. So basically, marksmanship is much more of a caster than most other casters, actually. Now, to make up the entire bottom list of our slower DPS, these 6 are joined by Elemental, Windwalker, Arcane, Survival Hunter and Frost Mage. For Elemental it makes sense, they mostly spam Lava Burst or Elemental Blast, so it doesn't make sense for them to be slightly under 1 button per minute. Windwalker in this context makes sense because a reasonable amount of cast they go for is Fist of Fury, which is a channeled ability, so they are just rolling their thumbs as they watch the animation of Fist of Fury go off. Arcane and Frost Mage also both make plenty sense, you know, Arcane Blast, Arcane Missiles, Frostbolt, Glacial Spike, those are all lengthy cast abilities, more so than 1 second or slightly less than 1 second, so it makes sense for them to be slow. Survival is the more neutral one, because this is the first one where we see they only have instant abilities, they even go for haste as a secondary stat themselves, so just the slightest of downtimes, you know, waiting to have the resource to spam Mongoose Bite, the cooldowns of Kill Command and your bombs, and then they are mostly at 1 button per second. Above this bottom 11 though, we now have this big clump of specs, all, you know, ranging into the almost or at 1 button per second, you know, the 60-ish APM range, consisting of a big bulk of specs. You have Ret, Assassination, Beast Mastery, Shadow, Frost DK, Unholy DK, Feral Druid, Subtlety Rogue, Arms Warrior, and Enhancement Shaman. And most of these, as you can see, are melee. That's what you can expect from a melee spec. You just press your melee ability every second. Some of them have slightly less haste, some of them have to wait perhaps for a bit more resources to come back, so they don't have anything to press. This is, for example, your button press downtime in your typical rotation. You can see Assassination and Subtlety and Ret. Some of the specs in this middle pack are at 8 to even upwards of 12% of their combat time spent waiting for resources, waiting for energy, waiting for holy power, waiting for combo points before they actually get to press their stuff. So that is going to be slowing down the amount of buttons you are pressing. The highlight in this big pack of, you know, expected melee specs being around 1 button per minute, because as a melee player, that's what you would expect. Every second I press something, is Shadow Priest, which is so far our highest of the casters. They are at 57, almost 1 per minute, which is interesting, right, because they are a caster. So you would expect them to actually be casting stuff that takes longer than 1 second per cast, making them at less than 60 APM, but they are quite close. Well, obviously, Shadow Priest is amongst one of the more instant spells type of caster that we have. When you enter Void form, your Void Bolt is instant, your Shadow Ward Death is instant, your Mind Blast, many of those are gonna be instants, even Insanity is casted quite quickly. You also go for Haste, of course, as a spec to be even faster in casting, so overall it gets to be quite a speedy spec even as a caster. So that's the first perhaps preference you might have if you were looking into casters. There is a significant difference in playing a Destruction Warlock type of caster versus playing a Shadow Priest type of caster, for example. But after this big clump in the middle, we start entering the speedy part of the specs, because this is where we start to be even faster than some of the tanks, like for example Guardian Druid or even Vengeance Demon Hunter. This is where we meet Balance Druid at 67 APM and Fire Mage. Those are going to be our 2 fastest casters in the game in terms of playstyle. Well, for Fire Mage, you might figure it out yourself already. They have Combustion. Combustion makes things a guaranteed crit, and on top of that, they get to play with insta-cast spells thanks to Hot Streak. So that entire cycle of casts is all instant. And then of course you also have Phoenix Flames, which is instant, you have Fire Blast, which is instant. As a spec yourself, you also go for a reasonable amount, a 5,000 something amount of haste to be even faster. That's what puts you well above the 1 button per second. Balanced Druid is perhaps a bit more interesting, because when you think about it, at first glance, Wrath and Starfire are both casted abilities. Well, the thing is, nowadays, balanced druids stays mostly, especially in single target and raids, but even mythic class very often, they stay in the solar eclipse, meaning Wrath spam, and Wrath has a very fast cast time, especially considering balanced druids also going for haste. You basically get Wrath to be on a 1 second cast time. And then you have Star Surge, which is instant, Sunfire, Moonfire, those are all instant. You play with Warrior of Elune to give you instacast Starfires as well. So overall, you actually get to have roughly 70-ish% of your button presses to be instant as a balanced druid. And because you are hasted, because you are pretty speedy in casting those things, and haste also reduces your global cooldown, how often you can press those buttons, you get to be quite fast, even as a caster, as a balanced druid caster. However, this was the highest the casters could go. After this, our top 3, our podium of fastest button pressers are going to be only melee, because we have Fury Warrior, Havoc Demon Hunter with 75 APM, and lastly, of course, Outlaw Rogue with 85 APM. In the case of Fury Warrior, they have this trio of very quickly spammed attacks, the cycle between Rampage, Bloodbath and Whirlwind being pressed very often, very quickly. They are not one of those melee specs that can end out of energy, out of combo points, out of runes, and they have to wait for something to happen. They pretty much always have something to press. Not only that, but they go for a reasonable amount of haste by themselves, and they are pretty much almost permanently in Enrage, which is even more haste for them, so even faster button presses for Fury Warrior. Havoc Demon Hunter does also have this, no issue with having something to press every second. They actually don't even go for that much haste as a secondary stat, they go for full crit, but, Metamorphosis already gives you 20% haste. You also have Furious Gaze after every I-beam to get 10% more haste as well, which gets you to spam those Chaos Strikes in combination with Throglaves very often, which makes it one of the busier rotations as far as melee specs go, which in general means one of the busiest rotations, as the melee specs are traditionally the faster ones in terms of button presses. However, nobody in the DPS department is faster than an Outlaw Rogue. Their devilishly fast combination of pistol shot and dispatch with between the eyes every once in a while is very, very fast. Now, you might be wondering, well, Outlaw Rogue doesn't even build into haste. Well, the combination of Adrenaline Rush being up basically all the time, giving you near infinite energy for you to spam things, plus Alacrity stacked up to give you 5% haste, a super high uptime of Taken by Surprise for an extra 10% haste, and the combo you go for of True Bearing and Broadside to give you even more combo points and even more cooldown reduction for buttons you can then go back at pressing again, makes you have a very fast button press rate with a nearly zero downtime as a spec. So definitely, if we go at this with the idea of, choosing a spec based on how hectic it is, if you're into that, then Outlaw Rogue has been pretty much the answer for the past few expansions in terms of how fast you get to press things. Much like Fire Mage also has been the answer when it comes to casters, if you want to be pressing things very quickly. Opposite direction, if you're looking at a slow and laid-back, chill spec, you have the Devastation Evoker as the true king. However, Devastation does have a pretty hectic cooldown phase period in its rotation. If you want a truly slow and laid-back spec pretty much at all times, then Marksmanship or even Affliction Warlock might be more to your liking. If you're looking at melee specs being on the slow side, then Windwalker, especially due to its channel, essentially Fist of Fury, giving you some breathing room before you go back pressing your buttons as usual. So this is the full list recapped on just about how how fast or how slow each spec is in playing out their rotation, both from the DPS as well as the tank perspective. Obviously, we have left healers out because healers, generally speaking, don't have a fixed rotation and in general would be be sitting roughly under the 60 mark, around 50 to 55 APM normally as a healer, more or less all of them together. So this is our informational video for the day for everyone, interested in looking into what specs to play for Season 4 and perhaps deciding based on, the style of play of each spec. For today, we are looking at the speed of execution of each spec's rotation. So for today, on this Wednesday, it's all we have to go for. We are starting as usual, saying goodbye to each other by thanking all of the Patreon supporters as well as everyone who is supporting for free. For example, liking and commenting down below on this video or subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these questionable things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, man, one of these days I will have to ask some of these chirping birds outside to do a collab. Otherwise, they will start asking me for royalties for my videos, given they feature every time.